On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jose Asuncion. He is the director of DevOps, and we're going to be talking about a pretty interesting topic. He's actually got a great background, moved from startups to larger companies. And we're going to be talking about when you join that larger company, the organization, your team, from a people perspective, team structure perspective, routines, cultures. We're going to try to touch on a lot of different areas if you're making that shift. I think Jose's got some great insights. I'm excited to have him on. Jose, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Amir, for having me. Actually, I've been with my company for, I think, 8 years now.
It's been a while.
That's a long time. And the joke we have in my company is that we all started out, we were all single guys. And then, we had our girlfriends, we got married, and then now we all have kids. So we grew, we grew as people as the company grew. And so it's a long time. And this is also my second startup. My first one, I began seeing some organizational patterns, although I was still working as a software engineer. And the first one was also pretty successful. We got acquired in 2014. And then with this one was a new start for me. We were, again, round two, starting from scratch. And then what I liked about this journey was we were starting from a small team of 3, and then now we're around 50, at least for the team I joined. And so we went through a lot of the stages. And through those stages, I was just thinking about, okay, how is this going to evolve? As time goes on, there's going to be leaders, and how do leaders know what they're going to do? So I sort of anticipated those questions. And then I really enjoyed, when I was in the spotlight to answer those questions, I really enjoyed finding answers to that.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as a company grows from that startup to being a large organization, a publicly traded organization, there's a variety of things that have to evolve and change. Obviously, you've seen it a couple of times, from the ground up. And I guess, it's a good analogy. You guys all joined as single individuals, and now you all have families. So obviously the environment has to kind of shift to support life changes and whatnot. So maybe let's talk about, I know you want to touch on a couple of different areas, from the people perspective, the team structure perspective. I guess let's maybe start with the actual team structure. So, joining a startup, your team was 3 people, now you're 50. I'm sure you had to go through multiple revisions of how a team gets structured, but maybe take us back to, when you were early stages trying to go from 3 to 5 to 10, and some of the drivers and kind of what you were looking at when and how you need to kind of re-examine team structure.
So in the beginning, obviously, it was pretty easy. There's only 3 of you, and then there's just a chat room. And also back then, this was obviously pre-pandemic. You can just tap each other on the shoulder and say, what are you up to? What did this change? You go out. And so that was pretty easy. And it sort of felt more like a close-knit friendship than it is now. Right now, I think one of the things I lament about, not really lament, but like I miss about in my state right now as a director is that the people I used to work with are just, they have their own team and they're doing their own things. And I miss that sort of brotherhood going on because we were all guys then. Now we're a more diverse team. I sort of miss that closeness going on in the beginning. And now when I have to, or when I need something from my counterpart in another, who now manages another team, before I was just sitting with him, he was even my roommate for 2 years. I just need to tap on the shoulder. Now I have to go through a ticketing system. And it sort of becomes less personal, more informal, and more rigid. So, but that was the beginning. It was very easy, very casual. And then I think 2-3 years later, we started hiring more. In the Bay Area, it's very competitive, as you know. And so it takes a while to ramp up when it comes to getting more team members to come on board. And so that took us around 2 years to get to a point where, whoa, okay, there's a lot of us now. What are we going to do? And then we still had that mindset of, we were still a startup, but then it's different when you're 3 and then now you go to 15, and then you still have that startup structure where, I still have access to the production database, or I still have access to the network switch, or, access to things that today would be off limits to me. That's when my curiosity got really picked at that point. How do we manage this better? Somebody just erased the database, at least the dev database, and we didn't find out about it till much later. And so we gotta start having some structure to how things are done. Also, because in a startup culture, you're really focused on helping ship a product. And so at least in my experience, having been part of three startups, one went under and then two very successful. Everybody, there's a very loose organization and everybody tries their best, even if they step on each other's toes, to really help the product be successful. And so everybody's just going on their own projects, and then they can inadvertently step into what other people are doing, right? And so that was 2 years. It wasn't that critical yet, but then some of these things were already starting to surface. And then 3 years later, oh, we got a big round, big round and more people. And then that's when the topic of my manager brought up, okay, well, we got to start having a little bit more layers. And so I went from senior engineer, and then now I have to manage people, and I just didn't know what to do. I was not trained for this. So my background is obviously in computer science. And now, as I've experienced, it's a very, very different problem. Sure, it's still software engineering, but you're not dealing with machines. Now it's people. And sometimes people don't come with the manual. Well, most people, all of us, we don't come with manuals.
There we go.
Yeah, machines come with manuals. And so the drivers, to answer your question, were just really very organic. It was the natural progression as the team started to become bigger. You have more work, and then you needed more coordination.
And I guess interesting, you're realigning the team, you're being promoted into management, you're good with the software, good with computers, the manual to run, work with people is something that, most people when they get promoted to management is new to them. So I guess when you're looking back and, the shift to the team structure, hindsight obviously is a little bit more clear now. Like, could you have envisioned, obviously if there was a mentor to have helped kind of guide you, obviously it's a startup, people are running hard, your manager's being promoted into a different layer himself or herself. So hindsight, is there any things that you could have seen done a little bit different to have made you more prepared to run a team?
So I mentioned I when I was promoted to manager, I had that question, what do I do? What do I do now? And I think I would have just, first, I would have probably brought these concerns earlier. But second, and this is what I think I'm proud of because I did this, was I really took a management course. And I'm going to plug the school I went to. So I'm taking Stanford Lead today, and that has helped me tremendously with everything that I've applied to my own team. And so I think that when a software engineer gets promoted to manager, I think it's really important to reskill because this is going to be a different skills are required.
I guess when you're looking at the team structure now, and obviously you guys are a team of 50, it's bigger. I'm sure you have managers, that you're managing as a director of DevOps. When you're looking at, identifying resources that are going to move into leadership roles, has your view of that changed, kind of having to, go through more of a trial by fire yourself?
Well, some people just show it very naturally that they have the leadership skills. They very naturally just, in a good way, boss people around and then tell them, okay, this is how we're going to do things. And so I have one direct report who's like that today. And some people are less expressive about that. And so, and I'm going to go into this later, but this is something that you have to work with to discover their talent and something you integrate into your processes.
And I guess, touching on the people side of it, obviously you need to identify the right people in the right seats, make sure people are prepared to move into those seats. So I guess as a manager, the company has shifted from a small startup to a very large company now. When you're looking at some of the training involved and having seen the whole maturation of the company, how valuable is training now to you? Is it something where, hey, people can learn on the job, or are you more focused on ideally like more structure around helping somebody ramp up, or how do you view that?
Right now, I think it pays to have that initial set of people who you identify those people who will become your senior team members. And then you train those people. And this is what I did in the beginning. When I was building my team, I was working, even before we had a team, I was already working closely with somebody who was junior to me. And then there was another one who came from another department. So identifying those people who you think have the strong potential to be good individual contributors, and also have that potential and patience for teaching. is key. Because then once you have, no, two is still pretty easy, but once you have two, three, four, five, six, you'll be relying on them a lot to hand over that knowledge that you hand over to them when it comes to training. And so there's a lot in Silicon Valley as, people here move fast. There's a lot of ad hoc and informal training that goes around. There's really more focus on that. We do have some formal training, but the pace of how things change is not really very friendly to that. So it's really important that your training is somehow built into your everyday routines.
Interesting. And I guess maybe touch on, so I think that's interesting because, obviously in the Bay Area, everything seems compressed in terms of timelines and you don't have the time to go, hey, let's train you and prepare you. Things are moving rapidly. They want to see results. They're not investing multi-million dollars to watch on the sidelines. So when you're talking about routines, and obviously that kind of helps as a part of, moving people through the training process as well. Kind of define, what do routines mean in this context?
Okay, routine is a shared understanding about how things will get done. So, but that involves, again, sensing, okay, what are the activities that your things do first? And then, so after you see that pattern, because there will be patterns. Because in the beginning, when you're a startup, all of these things are happening and then you don't have really time to look at patterns. But in my experience, I saw the pattern. Okay, these are the things that typically my team does. Every now and then there's going to be an odd thing that we'll do, but that's like maybe once in a blue moon. But there'll be patterns first to see what are the common things that your team does. And then once you identify those things that your team does, so in my case, we do a lot of projects and we do a lot of just operational day-to-day work. It's now trying to get to a consensus, or at least creating a process to how these things are going to be done. I like to bring up soccer analogy. Do you play soccer?
I watch a lot of soccer. I have not played much of my life, though.
Okay, cool. All right. Anyway, so in soccer, you have several activities. For example, you got defending, you've got attacking, and then you've got your transition plays, right? And so if you look at teams, different teams will do these very, very differently, right? So for example, when I was playing soccer in high school, when we get dispossessed of the ball, our team would compress in the middle. We would all fill the box, right? Other teams, like for example, FC Barcelona, you would see when they get dispossessed of the ball, they try to recover the ball in 5 seconds. So that's a routine, right? That's very different from my high school routine, right? So, but it's the same activity, which is defending. So routine is how you, understanding of how are we going to do these activities that we've identified that we're always doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's interesting is these routines, these activities that become, I guess, the optimal ones. Hopefully you're finding the optimal processes. They start building into culture because, you mentioned, the FC Barcelona, they're famous for the way they play. And obviously there's a certain system and process that has to be repeated. And I'm sure when you join their team, or if you join any specific, other type of sports team, if they have that structure in place, you already know what's expected, the culture is established, and I mean, maybe not even culture, but at least you understand what's expected. That expectation is also potentially easier for people to evaluate hiring, as well as, if you're making it very well apparent in the interview process, the person joining knows what they're getting themselves into.
That's true. One pattern I see here in Silicon Valley is everybody wants to hire superstars. They're always looking for the superstars, but maybe your problem is not for a superstar. Maybe you don't need a superstar. You don't need a Ronaldo. You don't need a Messi. Maybe you need 11 players who can work as a team, right? And one example I can give is I think in 2016, there was one team, I think Leicester City in the Premier League. They won the championship that year, but they didn't have any superstars, right? They had a good coach and they had 11 people who could work as a team. And so another example that's local to the Bay Area is, for example, the Oakland A's, and they made a movie about this with Brad Pitt. Have you ever watched the movie Moneyball?
Yeah, I like it. It's a good movie.
Yep, same thing. So they identified their goals, which was, okay, well, they reframed their goals, which is their goal was not to buy players, but to buy wins. right? We need to win. And to win, they were looking at correlations between what it takes to win, what metrics should we optimize for so that we can have more wins. And that metric was bases run, right? And so instead of hiring superstars, they hired players who could make more runs. And they understood that that's the way they were going to win. And they understood what it took, the routines to get there. And so, yes, it is the hiring, the routines, and then the culture, they pretty much should jive with each other.
It's interesting. The analogy of Moneyball and Silicon Valley, looking for the superstar. Everyone has this high bar, always trying to hire the best talent. When you're looking at your team, obviously you want to hire strong players. But the one thing I've always, I've asked hiring managers before, and I'll ask you is there a way of setting up your team so that you can break up some of that work so you don't have to be top heavy, so that, more mid-level or, junior type people can come on, contribute, help the team execute, still deliver? Obviously that puts a lot of pressure on, process, what we've been talking about, that puts a lot of pressure on the principal architects type of people. But how do you view that when it comes to hiring?
Well, it's very simple. You look at your gaps first. So, for example, right now, our gap is we don't have enough coverage in certain time zones, right? And so we're not really looking for a superstar. We need somebody to cover that gap, who's strong enough to cover that gap. And it all starts with what problem are you really trying to solve? Do you need an architect because your previous architect left and then you have new projects coming in, or do you just need to cover a certain time zone? So it all goes back to trying to figure out the problem.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I think, especially a company that gets at the smaller stage, because those routines and processes aren't established, the desire is bring in the strongest, that superstar, because you need to make sure you're establishing that to help scaling and reduce some problems down the road. As you kind of are further along now, your hiring gap is you guys have architecture, you have process, you can identify that particular hiring gap. So I guess the focus has changed a little bit because, you do have certain different luxuries at a larger company. When you're looking back, team size of 3 to now, do you think a lot has changed when you're looking at that hiring process and, finding that person to fill the gap versus, hey, I needed just the strongest person I could find because I need to offload work?
Yeah, absolutely. When we were hiring in the beginning, we had that problem. So we would do a debrief and everybody was just looking for superstars. And then when I got my own team, we already had some superstars. So we had the junior engineer who slowly became a senior engineer. And then we started a team. And so we had a senior engineer, but then I realized we have so much work. And so with so much work and we have this amount of timeline, right? And so I thought it would be a better value if we could get somebody who has strong fundamentals, but could quickly ramp up. So now you see the criteria is very, very different. You're not hiring a superstar, but somebody who could quickly ramp up.
Interesting. No, I like it because I think, I work with a lot of hiring managers, and sometimes the requirement is hard enough that it takes 6 months, 10 months to fill a role. And it's like, could you have somebody who's at a little bit earlier stage career join and within those 10 months learn? But then it's sometimes they're so constrained with, time to manage. They're like, well, if I had the time to manage, I could hire that person. But then I need somebody who comes in at that strong level because I just need them to be independent operators. But I think it's interesting what you said, because sometimes what fits the team the best, what value somebody can provide in terms of joining and providing that initial uplift of help versus the superstar that's going to come in and be a super strong player. There's two different ROIs based on what you're going to bring in.
And pretty much in my case, my strategy was to hire somebody with strong fundamentals and then grow. It was more of really a long-term play. Because you also bring up the point that it's hard to get superstars. It takes months. And in our case, we realized after 2 years that, okay, this is not working because we're just rejecting everybody, but there's some here who are good enough and can rise up. And so it's a long-term play, but it adds value in the sense that if you can take future candidates with strong fundamentals and then train them up, then I think that's an organizational capability that will add value to the company, because you are identifying future superstars and you're not hiring the superstars. So now I'm going back to the soccer analogy. These days, transfer fees are so inflated, right? So I think some players have gone for 200 million, 80 million. But if you can identify somebody who will become the next $80 million and then be able to replicate that very consistently, that adds a lot of value. I think other managers should start to think about, okay, well, maybe that's a better option than just waiting for somebody to come to the market.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic analogy. And I think that's where, when it comes to sports, obviously, it's easy to identify when a company does that successfully. And you can see teams that are very good at identifying players, whether it's early transfer fees or drafting them in later rounds and developing their skill. They're always more consistently at the top, because as one person leaves, they have somebody else to take that spot, and the drop off isn't as big. And I think it's actually absolutely right that organizational core competencies are expanded. If you can not just hire that superstar and you can bring in the mid-level and grow skills, I mean, that to me is a phenomenal thing to achieve. I guess when you're looking at that, and I guess going back to, team structure, the routines, kind of tying back a couple of things we've talked about, when you're designing your program to hire and bring in people to kind of come in at an earlier stage, doesn't have to be a startup. How much of your time is spent thinking about, hey, I do have these really strong players. I can bring in these more maybe mid-level or less strong people at this point and build them up because I have a little bit of lead time before the work, hits me or whatnot?
I think about it at the very least twice a year, because at least in my company, we move very fast. And I think also in other companies here in the Valley, it's like that. Things are changing all the time. And then so with the change comes, you gotta now think about all these 3-4 elements and see if it still fits within the company strategy, right? And the company strategies change all the time. So I guess it would be as often as how your company or your organization, because I'm part of a much bigger organization. What problems is the organization tackling? And then from there, you evaluate these 4 elements and see if you can still deliver with a higher performance in those. And so that will really depend on where you are as a manager, what kind of company you have. But for me, it's been twice a year because, well, I've only been a manager for maybe 3 years. So it's been twice a year because we've been ramping up really quickly. Now there's a need to go across all time zones, which we did not have 1 year before. And so it'll depend on what problems the bigger company has.
Awesome, man. I think there's a lot of great points within the discussion, especially as you're, growing from startup to publicly traded company, that a lot of people will be able to hopefully, relate to, learn from. Thanks for being on the podcast. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you doing this. If somebody wants to reach out to you to kind of pick your brain on anything you talked about, what's a good way of reaching out to you? LinkedIn?
LinkedIn would be great.
Okay, cool. We'll include your LinkedIn in the show notes. So if somebody wants to kind of reach out to Jose and talk about anything he's mentioned in the episode, feel free to do that. I guess that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, I always ask for 2 things. If you did find value in the podcast, if you could share it with someone else that might find value with it, that's how we've been growing. So I appreciate it. And secondly, if you want me to talk about a specific topic, hit me up, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you like, and let me know, and I'll do my best to find a guest to speak to that topic. Until next time, goodbye.